Evan sat in his dimly lit apartment, the hum of his computer the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. It was late, past midnight, but that's when he felt most alive, or at least most productive. The world outside seemed distant when he was buried in lines of code or deep into obscure corners of the internet. He didn't mind it. In fact, it was a relief. His real life, his mundane job at a small tech support office, his awkward social interactions had never been fulfilling. But the dark web, that was where things were different. The deep web was a place where he could lose himself, where his skills and curiosity could stretch far beyond the boundaries of the conventional. Evan wasn't a criminal. He wasn't searching for illicit materials or forbidden knowledge. But there was something undeniably intriguing about the obscure threads of the deep web. The secret forums, encrypted chat rooms, and shadowy messages that promised the kind of adventure that normal life simply couldn't provide. It was during one of these late-night deep dives that he first came across a new message. "You've been invited to play." The message appeared in an encrypted chat box on a forum he hadn't visited before. The interface was minimalist, just black background, green text, and an eerie absence of images or logos. It was a space designed for one thing: secrecy. The username of the sender was a series of random characters that meant nothing to him. The message, though, stood out. At first, Evan thought it was just another bot or a random spam message. But the words hung in the air longer than they should have. The forum wasn't the usual mix of conspiracy theories and hacking tutorials. It felt different, almost personal. "You've been invited to play," it said again. "A game awaits, but you must decide. Will you risk everything to uncover the truth?" Evan leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The curiosity gnawing at him was intense. His eyes scanned the message again. It didn't seem like a scam. It didn't offer anything immediately obvious. No links to download. No images of forbidden content. Just a question. A challenge. He let out a quiet laugh. "Whoever's behind this is playing some kind of weird game," he muttered to himself. His screen flickered for a moment, just enough to catch his attention, but Evan dismissed it. He had seen worse glitches. He was no stranger to coding errors, network disruptions, or even the occasional weirdly timed pop-up. After all, the deep web was a world of anonymity and chaos. Things weren't always what they seemed. Still, something about this felt different. Evan clicked the message. The screen turned black for a moment before a new window popped up. In the middle of the screen, there was a text box with a simple instruction. "Prove you're willing to play. Solve this puzzle and the game begins. Fail and you'll never hear from us again." A link appeared underneath the instruction, and Evan felt his pulse quicken. The link was simple, just a string of characters with no discernible meaning, no clear destination. But that was part of the allure of the deep web. Everything was veiled in mystery. Without hesitation, Evan clicked the link. The screen shifted again. This time, the background was a stark white, and a countdown timer appeared in the corner, counting down from 60 minutes. Below the timer was a puzzle, a series of images that didn't seem to fit together, broken pieces of what looked like old maps, distorted faces, and random objects that made no sense in the context of one another. The more he looked at them, the more he felt like they were trying to tell him something, but the message was just beyond his reach. He rubbed his eyes, blinking hard. Maybe it was just exhaustion from spending so much time on the computer. His mind felt a little foggy. Then the text appeared, almost as if it had been waiting for him to notice. "Find the connection between these images, and the next step will be revealed. Time is running out." Evan sat up straighter in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He studied the images again. A close-up of a weathered, cracked stone wall. A blurry figure standing at the edge of a forest. An old-fashioned lock with a key barely visible in the shadows. A darkened alley that looked like it could be anywhere in the world. The pieces didn't make sense, but his mind worked quickly. A lock, a key, an alley, and a stone wall. They had to be connected in some way. Was it a metaphor? Was the puzzle about something he had to uncover physically, somewhere in the real world? He typed the first thing that came to mind. A key to a hidden door. The puzzle blinked, the screen flickering again. The response was instantaneous. Correct. The next challenge awaits. Before Evan could even process the sudden rush of adrenaline, the screen changed again. The next puzzle was even more cryptic, filled with encrypted messages, symbols, and cryptic words. His heartbeat quickened, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. The clock was still ticking down. He had just under an hour to solve this. And then something changed. A new message appeared on the screen, one that Evan hadn't expected. This wasn't part of the puzzle. "Welcome to the game, Evan. I trust you'll find the next step interesting." The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. How did they know his name? He tried to shake it off, blaming it on some sophisticated hack or some form of deep web trickery. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, settling in his gut like a cold stone. He scanned the room, almost expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, waiting. Nothing. Evan refocused on the screen, his mind racing. The clock was ticking, but the real horror was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just a puzzle. This wasn't just some harmless challenge. Whoever was behind this game was watching him, tracking him. They knew things they shouldn't know. The next challenge was no longer just about solving puzzles, it was about survival. His fingers trembled as he typed his next response. The timer was ticking down relentlessly. One mistake and the game would be over. Another message appeared. "The collector is pleased with your progress. He's been watching. He always watches." Suddenly, the screen flickered again, this time much longer. And for the first time that night, Evan realized something that sent a chill down his spine. The game had only just begun. The screen flickered again, its eerie glow casting long shadows across Evan's room. His fingers froze on the keyboard as he processed the latest message that had appeared. "The collector is pleased with your progress. He's been watching. He always watches." He sat back in his chair, a chill creeping down his spine. He glanced nervously at the clock in the corner of the screen, 42 minutes left. The countdown didn't stop, nor did the next puzzle appear. Only that one message like a taunt hung on the screen. Evan quickly clicked away from the page, but it didn't respond. The mouse cursor spun in an endless circle as if the page was frozen. He closed and reopened the browser window, but it was still there, mocking him like an invitation he couldn't refuse. Who was this collector? And how could they possibly know his name? He'd never shared it with anyone. Never given any real details about himself on the deep web. Everything was anonymous. He thought about his life, his tech-savvy skills, his curiosity, and it all seemed trivial now. This wasn't some dark web game, this was real, and someone out there had his eye on him. He felt the weight of his situation settle over him like a suffocating blanket. Panic slowly crept in, but Evan pushed it back. He was no stranger to the deep web's oddities and traps. He'd seen hackers, scammers, and conspiracies all over the place. But this felt different. It was too personal, too directed. Just then, another message appeared on the screen. "Solve the puzzle, or your next choice will be your last." This time, Evan didn't hesitate. He clicked the link. His pulse quickened and the room seemed to grow colder. The new page that appeared was stark white. No images, just text. "You've entered a new level. The rules change here. You can no longer go back." Evan didn't know what to make of that. He read the next line, his eyes growing wide with disbelief. This is the game. Find the person who owns the next key, or it will be lost forever. Underneath, there was another cryptic image, an old photo, blurred but identifiable enough. It showed a small, dusty room with a single chair in the center. A dim light hung from above, casting deep shadows on the floor. There was something oddly familiar about it, something that made his stomach twist. The walls were lined with shelves, and among the clutter was a very specific object, a rusty old key. A name appeared beneath the image, William Hayes. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The name meant nothing to him, but the image of the key sent a shiver down his spine. He had seen keys like that before, rusty and worn. In fact, he'd even owned one once years ago, a part of an old lockbox he had inherited from a relative. He'd forgotten about it long ago, but the memory of the key lingered, hazy and distant. Could it be a coincidence? He clicked on the name, but instead of a link to another page, a short paragraph appeared. "William Hayes is an unfortunate soul. His fate is tied to the game. You must find him before he becomes a part of the collection." Evan sat there, staring at the text, trying to make sense of it. A name. A key. A mysterious person. Who was William Hayes, and why did the deep web game seem to know so much about him? His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and the first real sense of dread washed over him. The rules of the game were starting to make sense. This wasn't just about solving puzzles anymore. This was about real lives. Lives he was now a part of. He could feel the weight of it, pulling him deeper into a world that he had only touched on in the past. He typed the name into a search engine, hoping to find anything about William Hayes. The results were sparse, but the first hit caught his attention. William Hayes, the missing person. Evan clicked the link, his heart pounding. The article was short, but it detailed the disappearance of a man who had gone missing 3 years ago under bizarre circumstances. William Hayes was last seen walking out of a small cafe in New York City, and after that, no one had seen or heard from him again. The case was cold, and the authorities had no leads. The article mentioned an online forum where Hayes had been active shortly before his disappearance, posting cryptic messages and discussing dark web conspiracies. Could this be the same person? Evan muttered to himself. He clicked through several more links, digging deeper into Hayes' life. The deeper he went, the more the similarities between the man and the mystery behind the game became apparent. Hayes had been obsessed with the deep web, and before his disappearance, he had mentioned a strange game that he'd been trying to solve. The posts grew darker as he neared the end. His last messages were filled with cryptic warnings about the collector and how no one who got too close could escape. Evan's blood ran cold. This was no coincidence. The game he was part of was the same one that had consumed William Hayes. The collector had already taken someone before him, and now it was his turn. He leaned back in his chair, his heart racing. The countdown was still ticking, but his mind was no longer focused on the puzzle. The game had changed. It wasn't just about solving riddles anymore. He was in too deep, and there was no way out. Suddenly, the screen flickered again, and a new message appeared, as if reading his mind. You've made progress, Evan, but time is running out. Find William Hayes. The next step is closer than you think. Evan's eyes darted around the room. He wasn't alone. It felt as if eyes were watching him from the shadows, waiting for him to make his next move. But he didn't know where to go, what to do. He had no idea where William Hayes was or how to even begin looking for him. All he had was a name, a key, and a chilling warning that he was about to become part of the game's deadly collection. The timer on the screen ticked down faster now, and Evan knew with every passing second, the walls were closing in on him. He had to find the missing man, or his own fate would be sealed. And then, without warning, the page refreshed. The collector is watching, Evan. Find the key. Find William Hayes, or the game ends. A picture of a locked door appeared, the rusted key hanging in plain sight beside it. And beneath the image, time is running out. Evan sat in his chair, motionless, staring at the screen in front of him. The eerie glow of the computer was the only light in his apartment. His heart raced as he tried to process everything that had happened so far. His mind swirled with questions. What was the game? Who was the collector? And why had they chosen him? The room felt smaller, suffocating. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the countdown timer, now reduced to 22 minutes. He had no choice but to keep going. He knew that if he hesitated too long, he would lose whatever chance he had left. His eyes moved back to the page that had just refreshed. The locked door, the key, the name William Hayes. Everything about the game pointed to this man. But who was William Hayes? Why was his disappearance so intricately tied to the game? And what did he have to do with the key? Evan knew he had to act fast. There was no room for mistakes. The game was pushing him forward, and the walls were closing in. With trembling fingers, he typed the name William Hayes into the search engine again. But this time, the results were different. A new page popped up, one he hadn't seen before. The headline read, William Hayes, a man lost to the dark web. The article detailed the same basic facts he'd already read, but there was something new, something chilling. The article mentioned a dark web auction, a secret transaction that had taken place shortly before Hayes disappeared. According to the article, William Hayes had been looking for someone to help him solve the very puzzles Evan was facing now. Evan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a game, it was a twisted, real-life event. People had been disappearing for years, and the collector had been using the deep web to draw people in, baiting them with promises of secrets, riches, and forbidden knowledge. And then, just as Evan was about to dig deeper into the article, his phone buzzed on the desk. He jumped, startled. His heart raced as he grabbed the phone, expecting a notification from a friend, maybe even a spam text. But when he looked at the screen, there was only one message, an unknown number with a single sentence. "You're getting too close, Evan. If you want to live, stop searching." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. A sense of dread filled the room, the walls seemingly closing in. Who was this? Was this part of the game? His hands shook as he replied, typing the only thing that came to mind. Who is this? The reply came almost instantly. The collector knows who you are. He knows everything about you. He's been watching, waiting. The game is about to take its next turn. Evan stared at the message, his heart pounding. His eyes darted back to the screen. The timer was still ticking down, 15 minutes now. He felt the weight of every second like it was a countdown to his own demise. There was no escape from this, not anymore. He was too far in. Before he could respond, a new message appeared on his screen, this time directly in the game interface. "You've made great progress, Evan. But there's one more thing you must do before you can proceed." Evan's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his breath shallow. The message continued. "You must choose someone to sacrifice. A soul for a soul. Choose wisely." The blood drained from his face. What was this? Was it another twisted riddle, or was it real? The words on the screen stared back at him like a terrible ultimatum. He had no idea what this was about, but he couldn't ignore the gut-wrenching feeling in his stomach. He scrolled down to see what would happen next. Beneath the message was a list of names, people he knew. His friends. His family. People he'd known for years, some for a lifetime. His mother, his brother, his few remaining close friends. Each name had a small, red icon next to it, a warning. The collector had somehow gotten access to his contacts, his social media, everything. He knew everyone Evan cared about. Choose Evan. You must sacrifice one of them. The collector will claim the soul you pick, and in return, you will receive the key to the next level of the game. Fail to choose, and the game ends for you. His pulse hammered in his ears as the cursor hovered over the list of names. It was the kind of decision that no one should ever have to make, one that would haunt him forever. He had a choice, but it wasn't a real choice. His mind raced with panic. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again. A new message from the unknown number. "You know the rules, Evan. The game must go on. Make your choice." He stared at the screen, his mind scrambling for a solution, but there was none. This was part of the game, an impossible, horrifying part. Sacrifice someone or lose everything. The screen flashed again, and a new message appeared, this time in a different font, one that was large and unsettling. Time is running out. He had no choice but to click on one of the names. But which one? He couldn't even fathom the idea of choosing someone to die. He'd be responsible for it. He would be the one to pull the trigger. No, not literally. But he would be the cause. But then, a thought occurred to him. What if this wasn't real? What if it was all some kind of psychological game designed to break him? Could he refuse to choose and somehow escape the game? With trembling hands, he clicked on his brother's name. The screen blinked. "You've made your choice, Evan. The collector's demands have been met. The game continues." And just like that, the screen changed again. The images shifted, the timer disappeared. Evan could hardly breathe as he stared at the message that replaced the countdown. "The next challenge awaits you. You'll find the key in a place you know all too well." The page refreshed, and Evan was met with an image of his childhood home. Evan felt a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead as he stared at the screen. His hands shook as he sat in his chair, frozen by the message that had just appeared. "You've made your choice, Evan. The collector's demands have been met. The game continues." It felt as if the room around him was shrinking, the walls pressing in, suffocating him. His mind raced. He'd chosen. He'd sacrificed his brother. But had he truly? It didn't feel real. The choice didn't feel like his own. There was no turning back, but a part of him still hoped, still wished that it was all some kind of nightmare, that he could wake up from this twisted dream. And then the screen flickered again, pulling him back into the game. "The next challenge awaits you. You'll find the key in a place you know all too well." The image that followed hit Evan like a physical blow. It was a photo of his childhood home, exactly how it looked when he was a kid. The familiar red brick house, the large oak tree in the front yard, the chipped porch steps, and the faded front door. It was a place he hadn't been to in years. His parents had moved out years ago, and the house had since been sold. But the memories flooded back in a rush, memories of summers spent running through the yard, playing with his brother, and feeling safe. Before everything had changed. Evan's breath hitched as he stared at the image. Was it a trap? Was the game pushing him to go back, to face his past? He knew there was no real choice in the matter. This wasn't about finding the key, it was about following the rules, obeying the demands of the game. The collector had already made it clear there would be no escape unless he played along. Evan slammed his hand on the desk in frustration. He didn't want to go back there. He didn't want to face the ghosts of his past. The memories of the house were suffocating, of happier times before the accident, before the endless years of guilt and sorrow. And now this twisted game was dragging him back. But there was no other way forward. With a trembling breath, he grabbed his jacket and keys. His car was parked just outside. There was no time to waste. The game had already moved on. His next task was clear: find the key at the house or suffer the consequences. Evan drove through the night, the roads eerily empty, the darkness outside pressing in on him like a living thing. The car's headlights cut through the fog that had settled on the streets, and the hum of the engine was the only sound in the otherwise quiet world. His mind churned with thoughts of his brother and the decision he'd made. The words haunted him: sacrifice one. A soul for a soul. He kept telling himself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't be. But deep down he knew. He had chosen. And now there was no going back. When he arrived at the house, the familiar sight of it only made him feel more unsettled. The yard was overgrown, the grass uneven and wild. The oak tree that used to provide shade had long since lost its leaves. The once pristine porch was cracked and broken, the door sagging on its hinges. Evan stood in front of the house, staring at it as if it were some kind of monument to his past. The memories came flooding back, of the laughter, the warmth of family dinners, and then the sudden, tragic event that had shattered everything. The car accident that had claimed his parents' lives, leaving him and his brother alone. The guilt, the grief, the years of unanswered questions. It had been too much for his brother to handle. While Evan had buried himself in work, in technology, and in the false security of the internet, his brother had slowly descended into a world of his own, lost in the pain and the unresolved trauma of that night. And now Evan had chosen him. The thought made him feel sick, but the game pushed him forward. The screen had said the key was here. He walked toward the front door, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. The door was ajar, as if waiting for him. He pushed it open, the old wood creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The house was dark and cold. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled stale, like time had stopped here. The familiar warmth of home was gone, replaced by the unsettling emptiness of abandonment. But something else was there too, a sense of dread, like something was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. Evan moved cautiously through the house, his footsteps careful as he navigated the rooms. The living room was the same, the faded couch still sitting against the wall, the family photos hanging crookedly. He avoided looking at them, the memories were too painful. It was when he reached the basement door that the sense of unease became unbearable. The door, once solid and sturdy, now seemed to beckon him. He knew what was down there. It was the place he never wanted to return to, the place where his brother had locked himself away after the accident. The basement was where his brother had hidden, consumed by grief. The place where everything had changed. The basement door creaked open as Evan stepped forward. The smell of mildew and dust hit him, and the dim light at the top of the stairs barely illuminated the narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. He hesitated for a moment, but then, without another choice, he descended. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, and it felt wrong in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It was darker than he remembered, the only light coming from a flickering bulb hanging above. The shelves were cluttered with old boxes and forgotten belongings. But there, in the far corner, something caught his eye. A small wooden box sat atop a dusty shelf, barely noticeable in the dim light. But it was the key. He knew it the moment he saw it. The rusty old key from the photo, the one that had haunted his thoughts. It was sitting there, waiting for him. Evan approached the box slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As his hand reached out for the key, something moved in the corner of his eye. A shadow. A figure. He froze. "You shouldn't have come back, Evan." The voice was low and raspy, a whisper in the dark. Evan's blood ran cold. "You can't escape the game." The shadows shifted, and the figure stepped into the faint light. It was his brother, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt, like something had taken everything from him. And then, the figure smiled, and Evan realized with a sickening jolt that the game wasn't just about finding the key. It was about something far worse. Evan's heart slammed in his chest as he stood frozen in the basement, staring at the ghostly figure of his brother. His mind couldn't process the scene before him. The gaunt face, the hollow eyes, everything about the figure was wrong. It wasn't the brother he had known, the one who had laughed with him, who had been his partner in crime growing up. This thing, this creature, was nothing but a shadow of what was once human. "You shouldn't have come back, Evan." The voice was raspier than he remembered, as if his brother hadn't spoken in years, as if the words were foreign to him. But it was his brother's voice. The same voice that had called out for him during their childhood games. The same voice that had been drowned out by the screams the night their parents died. Evan's fingers twitched, his hands still hovering over the key that lay in the wooden box. He knew he should grab it. He knew that this was the next part of the game. But he couldn't move. His legs felt like stone. "You can't escape, Evan." The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky, unnatural. It didn't seem like his brother. It was as if the body was being controlled by something else, something malevolent. The eyes that once held warmth were now empty, consumed by darkness. Evan finally managed to speak, his voice shaky. What happened to you?" His brother's lips twisted into a smile, a grin that was far too wide, far too unnatural. "You left me here. You left me to rot." The words hit Evan like a punch to the gut. His stomach churned, guilt rising within him. He had tried to block out the memories, the times he had failed his brother, when he had buried himself in work, in the comfort of technology, while his brother struggled with the grief that had consumed him. He had pushed him away, thinking it was easier to run from the pain. But now, standing in front of this hollow shell of his brother, he understood the truth. His brother hadn't just been struggling. He had been dragged into something far darker, something that had twisted his mind. The game had been watching them both long before Evan even realized. "The collector," Evan whispered, his throat tight. His brother's smile faltered for a moment, his expression shifting into something more sinister. "The collector owns you now, Evan. He owns us all." The words sank into Evan's chest, a weight that made it hard to breathe. The game wasn't just a series of challenges. It was an entity, an unseen force that had preyed on his brother, on him, and now it was coming for him. The collector wasn't just a game master, it was something more ancient, more evil, a being that thrived on control, manipulation, and suffering. Evan's fingers finally closed around the key, the cold metal sending a jolt of ice through his hand. The moment he touched it, the basement seemed to shift. The shadows deepened. The air grew colder. "You've made a terrible mistake, Evan." His brother's voice echoed in the room, and then the figure collapsed to the ground, a lifeless shell once more. Evan's breath caught in his throat. The moment his brother fell, something in the room changed. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with a low, guttural hum. The key in his hand grew hotter, its metal burning against his skin. The room began to warp, the floor beneath him bending, distorting as if the very house were coming alive. A harsh voice, low and mocking, filled his ears. "You've come far, but this is only the beginning." Evan spun around, looking for the source of the voice. There was no one. Just the darkness. But the voice was unmistakable, a voice filled with centuries of malice. "You've played my game, Evan. But you can never win." The walls seemed to close in around him, and the house began to crumble, its foundations shaking. The basement door slammed shut, and the lights flickered before dying completely, plunging Evan into complete darkness. He could hear something moving in the dark, a presence far too close for comfort. His heart hammered in his chest as he fumbled for his phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the pitch-black basement, revealing nothing but dust and decay. But as his light swept across the room, something caught his eye. A shadow, a figure moving in the corner. "You are the final piece, Evan." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Evan turned quickly, but he couldn't see anyone. The shadows danced around him, swirling like dark tendrils. The air was thick with a suffocating presence. He backed toward the stairs, but the shadows followed, crawling up the walls and curling around his feet. "You thought you could escape. You thought you could outrun the game." The words echoed in his mind, wrapping themselves around him like a noose. Evan bolted for the stairs, his feet stumbling in the dark, the beam from his phone flickering with each desperate step. He reached the top and pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door, once broken and hanging loosely on its hinges, was now completely sealed. The light from his phone flickered once more, and then the room went completely dark. A low, rumbling laugh filled the space around him. It was the collector's laugh, dark, mocking, and endless. "There's no escape, Evan." Evan's pulse raced as his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. There was only one thing left to do. The key. The key had to be the answer. It had to open the door. The game was twisted, cruel, but it wasn't unbeatable. He wasn't going to let this thing win. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, his fingers trembling as he approached the door. The moment the key touched the lock, the room went silent. The darkness seemed to hold its breath. Evan twisted the key, and the door creaked open, revealing the light of the hallway beyond. He bolted through, not daring to look back. His pulse still hammered in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. And the collector, whatever it was, had no intention of letting him go. Evan stumbled down the hallway, the dim lights overhead flickering like weak, dying stars. His mind raced with everything he had just experienced. He couldn't shake the image of his brother, the twisted mockery of the person he had known. It was as if the collector had torn his brother apart, hollowing him out, and left only the shell of a man in his place. The air in the house felt wrong, heavy with something ancient and malevolent. Every step he took made the floor creak beneath him, the house itself groaning in response, as though it were alive, aware of his every movement. The house was more than just a place now. It was a labyrinth, a prison designed to trap him and keep him in its grasp. His heart was still racing, but his thoughts were clear. The key had opened the door. It had been the only way out of that room, and yet it hadn't solved anything. It had only deepened the mystery. The collector hadn't let him go, it had merely given him a false sense of hope, a way to move to the next level of its game. Evan's fingers tightened around the key. It burned against his skin. He could feel its power, its weight. It was more than just an object, it was a symbol. A symbol of control, of manipulation. Every time he thought he understood the rules, they shifted. The game evolved, and Evan was forced to evolve with it or face the consequences. When he reached the front door of the house, he paused. The door, once locked and sealed tight, was now wide open, just like it had been when he first arrived. The night outside was eerily quiet. The familiar street was shrouded in darkness, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. It was almost as if the house was offering him an escape, a way to leave it all behind. But Evan knew better. He knew that walking out that door would be just another part of the game. The collector had no intention of letting him go so easily. The world outside didn't matter. The game had already taken root in his mind. With a final glance at the house, he turned away, feeling the weight of the key in his hand once more. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and his heart leaped into his throat. He pulled it out, his hands shaking, and saw the message. "Congratulations, Evan. You've passed the first test. But there's more to come." The words stung as if the collector were mocking him. Evan's eyes darted nervously around the empty street. He knew the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, trying to push down the panic rising in his chest. He had to stay focused. He had to keep moving forward no matter how much he wanted to turn back and forget it all. As he walked down the street, a sudden thought struck him. The collector had known his name. It had known about his family, his brother, his deepest fears. How could it have access to all of that? How could it have manipulated him so completely? The answer was simple, it was watching him. Always. Evan quickened his pace, his breath shallow. The further he walked, the more the feeling of being hunted gnawed at him. It wasn't just the collector he had to worry about. It was the growing realization that the game had already begun to infect his mind. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of his eye made him question what was real and what was just another part of the game. His phone buzzed again. "You haven't learned yet, Evan. The collector is always watching." Evan's stomach dropped. He stopped in his tracks, glancing around wildly. No one was there. The street was still empty, silent. He checked the time on his phone. The countdown had begun again. The next challenge awaits. It's closer than you think. His heart pounded. The words were like a taunt. The next challenge? What was it this time? What did the collector want from him? He didn't know, but he didn't have a choice. He had to keep playing. He had no other option. If he didn't, he'd be trapped in the game forever. Suddenly, he felt the ground beneath his feet tremble. The streetlights flickered, their dim glow casting strange shadows across the sidewalk. Something was changing. Something was moving beneath the surface. Evan's eyes snapped toward the nearest alley. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly but deliberately. Evan's breath caught in his throat. It was a man dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. The figure didn't say anything, but as he drew closer, Evan could feel an unsettling presence. The figure didn't seem human. There was something wrong about the way he moved, the way his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if he wasn't quite right. Evan took a step back, his heart hammering. He didn't know if this was part of the game, if this was just another twisted challenge designed to break him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the figure wasn't just a player. It was something else. "You're too late." The voice that came from the figure was low and guttural, like it came from deep within a well. Evan froze, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He had heard that voice before, the collector's voice. The man was a puppet, and the collector was pulling the strings. The figure reached up, pulling back his hood to reveal a face that made Evan's stomach churn. The man's features were distorted, twisted, as if the very essence of him had been reshaped. His eyes were empty, hollowed-out sockets that seemed to peer into Evan's soul. "It's too late for you, Evan. You're already part of the game." Before Evan could react, the figure lunged at him with terrifying speed, grabbing his wrist and pulling him toward the darkness of the alley. The collector is waiting. Evan tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. He fought back, his breath ragged, but it was no use. The man, if it could even be called a man, dragged him deeper into the alley. His mind raced and his thoughts clouded with fear. The game had taken another twisted turn and there was no escaping it now. "You will never be free." The words echoed in Evan's mind as the world around him went dark. Evan's head spun as he stumbled through the alley, the figure's unyielding grip around his wrist sending waves of panic through his body. His heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how hard he struggled, the figure's grasp didn't loosen. He tried to twist free, to yell out, but his voice felt trapped in his throat, suffocated by the unrelenting darkness of the alley. Everything felt wrong. The air, thick with the scent of decay, seemed to close in around him. The faint glow of the streetlights above barely cut through the darkness, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The figure didn't speak anymore, it just dragged him deeper into the alley where the light seemed to fade entirely. Evan's mind raced. He needed to think. He had to escape. But the more he tried to focus, the more his thoughts became clouded by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He was being pulled into something far worse than he could have ever imagined. The collector wasn't just playing a game, it was manipulating him, controlling everything. "Where are you taking me?" Evan managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer immediately, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing off the brick walls as they walked deeper into the alley. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the figure spoke, its voice cold and raspy. "To the end of the game." Evan's pulse quickened. What did that mean? Was this it? Was this where it all ended? The figure finally released his wrist and pushed him forward toward a towering, dark door at the end of the alley. The door was covered in rust and grime, its surface so decayed it almost seemed like it had been there for centuries. Evan's stomach twisted as he approached it. Every instinct in him screamed to run, to escape before it was too late. But something kept him rooted in place. His feet felt like lead and his hands trembled as he reached for the door handle. The moment his fingers brushed against the cold metal, the door creaked open on its own, revealing an interior bathed in shadow. "Enter, Evan." The figure's voice echoed from behind him, but Evan didn't turn around. There was no use. He was already too far in. He stepped over the threshold, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening thud. Inside, the air was thick with a musty, metallic scent. The room was vast, its dimensions impossible to make out in the dim light that flickered from above. The walls stretched endlessly, and Evan realized with growing horror that there was no clear direction. No walls, no boundaries. Just an endless space filled with shifting shadows. But that wasn't what truly horrified him. It was the faces. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, lined the walls in rows. They were nothing more than hollow, ghostly visages, eyes wide open in a permanent state of terror. Their mouths were frozen in silent screams, contorted in a way that made Evan's stomach churn. The faces were all different, some familiar, others unfamiliar. Some looked like his own family, others like people he had never seen before. But they all shared one thing in common, they were terrified. He recoiled, his breath coming faster. This wasn't just a room, it was a prison. These faces were trapped, caught in the endless loop of fear and suffering, their existence reduced to a never-ending nightmare. "Welcome to the maze, Evan." The voice came again, deep and resonant, but it wasn't the figure behind him anymore. It was coming from everywhere. He turned, looking desperately for the source of the voice, but there was no one. Just the faces staring at him, judging him, waiting. This is where the game ends for some. This is where you will either succeed or be lost forever. The voice continued, each word dripping with menace. Suddenly, the walls shifted, the faces morphing and warping as if they were part of some twisted, living entity. The shadows around Evan began to move, stretching and twisting like tendrils, wrapping around his body, pulling him deeper into the maze. The air grew colder, and Evan's limbs grew heavy. The walls around him seemed to pulse, closing in, as if the room itself was alive, hungry for something. He tried to run, but his legs were sluggish, his body weighed down by an unseen force. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move fast enough. The walls grew closer, the face's eyes seemed to track his every movement as if they were alive, breathing. Then something caught his eye, a flash of movement. In the distance, through the shifting shadows, he saw a figure. It was familiar, but it was too far away to make out clearly. "Help!" Evan shouted, his voice hoarse. The figure didn't respond. It just kept moving farther away, its steps deliberate and unhurried. Without thinking, Evan started toward it, desperation fueling his every step. The maze seemed to shift around him, growing more disorienting, but he pressed on. He couldn't let it get away. It might be the answer to escaping this nightmare. It might be his only chance. As he moved deeper into the maze, the shadows grew darker, the walls more twisted. The faces on the walls grew more distorted, their expressions more grotesque, but Evan couldn't stop. He was too close now. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, he reached the figure. It was standing still, facing away from him. Evan reached out a trembling hand to touch its shoulder, but as he did, the figure turned to face him, its face empty, a hollow, dark abyss where its eyes should have been. No one escapes. The voice wasn't the collector's. It wasn't anyone's. It was cold, distant, and unfeeling. The world around Evan began to warp again. The walls closed in faster, the faces screaming, their eyes filled with agony. The maze was alive, and it was swallowing him whole. Evan screamed, trying to pull away, but the walls reached out, their fingers made of shadows, dragging him down. He fought with everything he had, but it was useless. The faces were getting closer, the shadows closing in, and the darkness began to consume him. Just before he was swallowed entirely, he heard one last whisper. "You are mine now, Evan." Evan's breath was ragged as the darkness closed in around him. The maze of shifting shadows and screaming faces consumed him, dragging him deeper into the unknown. The walls seemed to pulse with life, pressing closer, tighter, until the space around him felt suffocating. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last. His body screamed in protest, but there was nowhere to go. The maze was alive, and it was slowly suffocating him. His limbs felt numb, his movements sluggish, as if he were swimming through molasses. He couldn't think. His mind was clouded by the crushing weight of the shadows pressing in from every direction. The faces on the walls were closer now, their eyes following his every movement. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. Waiting for him to break. Waiting for him to succumb to the horror. "You will never leave." The voice was everywhere, coming from every direction at once. It wasn't the voice of the figure who had brought him here. It was the voice of the collector itself, low, cold, and all-encompassing. Evan stumbled forward, the walls narrowing with every step. The maze seemed endless, and he realized that no matter how far he went, he would never reach the end. It was designed that way. The collector had designed it that way. To trap him. To break him. His hand reached out to steady himself against the wall, but the surface felt wrong. The shadows didn't just cling to the walls, they were part of them. The walls were shifting, alive, like the very foundation of the maze was feeding off his fear. "You think you're different. You think you can escape." Evan's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. His hands shook uncontrollably, his mind scrambling for any semblance of clarity. The faces around him, so many faces, were starting to blur together. Some were strangers, but others were people he knew. People he had lost. His parents. His brother. The friends he'd pushed away. Faces of people who had once been close to him, now twisted and distorted in ways that made his stomach churn. Were they here because of him? Had the game taken them too? Evan's mind began to unravel as the maze closed in tighter. He couldn't escape. He couldn't outrun the collector. The rules of the game were beyond his comprehension, beyond his control. He was nothing more than a pawn, a player in a game he couldn't win. And then, just as he thought he would lose himself to the madness, a new sound cut through the darkness, a sound that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere ahead of him. They echoed through the maze, sharp and clear, cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. Evan's heart skipped a beat. The footsteps were getting closer. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking with fear. He didn't know why he asked. He didn't know if there was anyone else in this hellish maze with him. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed felt heavier than anything he had ever experienced. And then a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, reached his ears. "Evan." He turned toward the sound, his breath hitching. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was his brother's voice, the one he had lost. "Evan, you're not alone." He froze. Was this real? Was this the game trying to trick him again? Or was it something more? The voice called again, this time louder, more urgent. "Evan, you have to wake up. You're not trapped here. Not yet." Evan's mind spun. What was happening? Was his brother still alive? Was this really him, or was it another part of the game, another twisted illusion? The footsteps began again, but this time they were running toward him. No, the word escaped his lips before he could stop it. "This isn't real. You're not real." But as the footsteps grew louder, as the figure emerged from the shadows, Evan's heart stopped. There, in front of him, stood a man, no, a boy. It was his brother, but not as he remembered him. The figure was covered in shadows, his face obscured by a dark hood. I'm real, Evan. I've always been real." Evan took a step back. His body trembled, his mind unable to process the sight before him. His brother? Was this his brother? Or was it the collector playing yet another trick? You have to fight, Evan. You have to stop the game. The figure stepped closer, its voice growing more insistent, more desperate. This isn't the end, but it could be if you let it. You still have a choice. Evan's heart thudded in his chest. His brother was telling him to fight, to stop the game. But how? How could he stop something that controlled everything? The key. The figure whispered. The key you hold. It's the only way. The key. The key he had carried all this time. He hadn't understood its true power, hadn't realized it wasn't just a tool, but a symbol. A symbol of control. But if it was the answer, why had the collector allowed him to keep it? Evan gripped the key tightly in his hand, feeling its cold metal bite into his palm. The maze was still closing in around him, the faces still staring, judging. His brother's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to act, to take control. But could he? Was he strong enough to break free? The figure stepped forward again, but this time it reached out, offering something. A small, crumpled piece of paper. You have the choice, Evan. The game ends when you decide. Evan looked at the paper in his hand. The message was simple. The price of freedom is the price of the key. Choose wisely. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he held the paper, his mind racing. He could end it all. He could break free. But at what cost? The game was nearly over. But was he ready to pay the price? The paper in Evan's hand felt impossibly light, as if it were nothing but an illusion. The words written on it were simple, but their meaning weighed heavily on his mind. The price of freedom was the price of the key. He stared at the message, his thoughts swirling in confusion. He had carried the key with him for what felt like an eternity, through every twist and turn of the game, through every nightmare the collector had subjected him to. The key had been both his guide and his curse, a symbol of hope and fear all at once. But now he realized that it was more than just a key. It was the gateway to his future. It held the power to end the game or keep him trapped forever. He looked back at the figure of his brother, whose face was now fully illuminated in the dim light of the maze. His brother's eyes were wide, full of an emotion Evan couldn't quite place. They weren't the eyes of someone who had been lost to the darkness. No, these were eyes filled with something deeper, something almost human. Evan, you still have a choice. The figure's voice was soft now, pleading. The key has the power to set you free, but it requires a sacrifice. You have to give something up, Evan. Something important. Evan's heart pounded as the words sank in. A sacrifice. The key was not just a tool for escape, it demanded a price. But what could he give up? What was the collector asking of him this time? He gripped the key tighter, feeling the cold metal digging into his palm. His brother's image flickered before him, shifting between his true form and the twisted, hollow version he had seen in the basement. The faces in the maze seemed to pulse in rhythm with his thoughts, their eyes watching him with a mixture of longing and accusation. You've already lost so much, Evan. The figure's voice was growing distant, the shadow of doubt creeping in. You can't escape without paying the price. You can't undo what's been done. Evan felt his breath catch in his throat. He had lost so much. His parents. His brother. The people who had meant everything to him. And now it seemed like the collector wanted him to lose something even more. What more was left to sacrifice? What else could the game take from him? His mind raced, but there was one thing he knew for sure, the choice was his. The collector could push him, force him to face horrors, but it could not make the decision for him. He looked at the paper again, the words standing out clearly in his mind. The price of freedom is the price of the key. The game had always been about choices. Every puzzle, every test had been a chance to choose a path. But now it wasn't just about solving riddles. It was about deciding who he was willing to become. Would he let the game define him, or would he break free? The walls of the maze continued to shift and groan, pressing in on him, and the faces seemed to draw closer, their mouths wide open, silently screaming. The shadows moved, creeping around his feet, reaching out with cold fingers. Evan could feel the weight of their gaze, judging, waiting. And somewhere in the distance, the collector's voice echoed, distant yet unmistakable. You will never escape, Evan. The game is yours to play, but there is no winning. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The collector had never wanted him to win. There was no winning in the collector's game. It wasn't about freedom, it was about control. The collector thrived on fear, on suffering, on keeping people trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. But Evan wasn't just anyone. He was a player in this game, and that meant he had power. Power to choose. Power to break free. The paper, the message, the key, they were all part of the same truth. He had been holding onto the key, clutching it like a lifeline, but now he realized that the true power wasn't in the key itself. It was in his ability to decide. To choose. He looked down at the key, the cold metal in his hand. The price of freedom. His heart was pounding in his chest as he took a deep breath, his mind cleared by the realization. He had to make the choice. He could continue to play the game, to remain trapped in the maze, surrounded by the faces of the lost, or he could let go of the one thing that tied him to this world, the key itself. It was the ultimate sacrifice, and he knew what he had to do. With one last glance at the figure of his brother, who was now a mere shadow in the growing darkness, Evan raised the key high above his head. The moment his hand lifted it, the room around him seemed to freeze. The walls stopped moving. The shadows ceased their crawling. The faces fell silent. The key began to glow, its cold surface radiating an otherworldly light. It was as though the very fabric of the maze was unraveling before his eyes. The whispers of the faces grew louder, but their voices were no longer filled with judgment, they were filled with fear. "You made the right choice, Evan." His brother's voice whispered in the silence, but it was not a plea. It was a declaration. Evan took a step forward, his heart still pounding, but a new sense of clarity settled over him. The game was over. He had won, not because he had defeated the Collector, but because he had finally chosen his own path. As the key continued to glow, the maze began to dissolve around him. The walls, the faces, the shadows, they all faded away, leaving nothing but an empty, endless space. And then, the light from the key burst outward in a brilliant flash, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, he was standing outside. The maze was gone. The house. The alley. The Collector. All of it was gone. The world before him was silent still. The air was crisp and the night sky above was vast and free of the looming dread that had consumed him. He had escaped. But as he took a tentative step forward, Evan knew that there was no true escape from the game, not completely. The Collector was always watching, always waiting. But for the first time in a long while, Evan felt something else, something stronger than fear. Freedom. Evan stood on the edge of the world, the light of the key still burning bright in his hand. The maze, the house, the endless corridors of terror, everything had faded into nothingness. It felt unreal, like a dream he was waking from. But the chill in the air, the quiet night stretching infinitely before him, reminded him that it was real. He had escaped. Or had he? For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Evan took a deep breath, inhaling the cool night air. He looked around at the empty street, the distant skyline, the dark sky above him, and he realized something unsettling. The world looked just like it had before. The same. Unchanged. The same quiet emptiness. The same haunting silence. But something was different. Evan's hand tightened around the key. The glow from it had dimmed, but it was still warm, almost alive. The familiar sense of being watched tugged at the back of his mind, the feeling that no matter how far he had run, no matter what he had left behind, the game was not over. A distant sound echoed through the silence, a low, mocking chuckle that sent a chill down Evan's spine. His heart sank. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" The voice was familiar, too familiar. Evan spun around, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was the Collector, his voice cold and dripping with disdain. "You were always part of the game, Evan. You were never meant to escape." Evan's blood ran cold. The words echoed in his mind, and he realized the terrifying truth. The Collector wasn't just an entity he could defeat. The Collector was an idea. A force that existed in the deepest corners of the human mind, feeding on fear, controlling the narrative. As long as there was fear, the game would never truly end. Evan's hands shook as he held the key tighter. He had chosen. He had sacrificed. He had broken the cycle, but at what cost? Was he still trapped in the game, or was the game something that could never be fully escaped? He turned, looking back toward the dark horizon, where the night seemed to stretch into eternity. The street in front of him was empty, still, peaceful, but there was an unmistakable feeling that someone was lurking just out of sight, watching. "You're still playing, Evan." The voice again, closer now, reverberating through his chest. "You're always playing." The shadows around him seemed to twist, to bend unnaturally. For a moment, the world around him flickered like a screen about to turn off. He saw flashes of the maze, the twisted faces, the dim corridors he had left behind. They were trying to pull him back, dragging him into the darkness once more. "No," Evan whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not playing anymore." The key burned hot in his palm, and Evan raised it above his head, the faint light glowing brighter as he steeled himself for whatever came next. The Collector's laughter echoed in his mind, but Evan clenched his jaw and stepped forward, his footfall steady. "I won't let you control me anymore," Evan muttered through clenched teeth. His gaze sharpened, locking onto the space before him, the shadows that surrounded him. "I choose to be free." And with those words, everything changed. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, and for a moment, the sky above him darkened. The air grew thick, but instead of a feeling of being trapped, there was something new, a sharp, distinct clarity. The shadows pulled back, retreating into the distance like the last remnants of a nightmare fading with the dawn. The oppressive presence of the collector grew quieter, distant, until it was almost gone. It wasn't gone, it had been banished. The control it once held over him was slipping away. The key in his hand glowed once more, but this time it wasn't a beacon of fear. It was a symbol of his choice. The choice to take control. To let go of the game. The laughter, the mocking voice of the collector, fell silent. The shadows melted into the ground and the maze, along with everything it represented, vanished. Evan stood alone in the street, the world around him now strangely calm, serene even. The oppressive weight was gone. The feeling of being watched, the suffocating terror that had clung to him for so long, was gone. He had made the choice to break free. To end it. But even as the world seemed to settle, Evan couldn't help but look over his shoulder. He had won, yes, but there was always the lingering fear that the game was still out there, watching, waiting. For now he was free. He dropped the key to the ground, the soft clink of metal ringing in the still air. It landed with a hollow sound that echoed far too loudly, as though the game was still alive within it, waiting for someone else to pick it up, to begin the cycle again. Evan turned away from it and walked into the night, not looking back. As he walked, he felt the weight of his choices, the sacrifices he had made, and the truth of the journey he had endured. The game had nearly consumed him, had nearly shattered him. But he had broken free. For now, the game was over. But in the back of his mind, Evan knew the truth. It was never really over. The collector was always watching.